En primer lugar, es un placer estar aquí de nuevo en Casa África y creo que la primera palabra debe ser de agradecimiento a Casa África por haber apoyado el coloquio que estamos organizando desde la Universidad con el profesor Miguel Suárez Bosa y que gracias a su dinamismo y a su predisposición absolutamente positiva desde el primer minuto, cuando les propusimos que el profesor Olukoju viniera a visitarnos y a compartir su experiencia y su trabajo, pues gracias a ese apoyo estamos hoy aquí. En cualquier caso voy a ser muy breve porque la trayectoria académica del profesor Olukoju es muy extensa y ciertamente, no quiero destacar ninguno de sus méritos como investigador y como académico, porque son muchos y entonces sería injusto, ¿no? Pero básicamente la idea general es que tenemos hoy aquí a uno de los historiadores de la economía africana y de la historia marítima africana más reconocidos y más reputados a nivel internacional. Hay que recordar que el profesor Ayodeji Olukoju fue el primer africano que formó parte del comité científico de la Asociación Internacional de Historia Marítima. Pero no fue por azar, sino por una trayectoria de investigación y de publicaciones impecable durante décadas. Entonces, no voy a profundizar mucho más, sino agradecer también la predisposición del profesor Ayodeji aquí en Las Palmas. Ha sido un viaje largo, le han perdido la maleta, pero sigue aquí. Entonces, simplemente pues agradecer su presencia y agradecer también su presencia y de nuevo el apoyo de Casa África para poder hacer esta actividad. Y ahora disfrutaremos con el trabajo espléndido del profesor Olukoju. Gracias.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Usually in Nigeria, I will start by saying, my lords, spiritual and temporal, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. The reason is that in Nigeria, you have to acknowledge your excellencies, that is to say governors, politicians, and all that. You also have to acknowledge the bishops and all the clergymen, and therefore, I devised a solution of simplifying things. When I say my Lord spiritual, that takes care of bishops and all the religious leaders, and my Lord temporal will take care of politicians, whoever, directors and all that. So tonight, my Lord spiritual and temporal, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, because all of us are represented here. Let me say that it's a great pleasure indeed and a great honor to be asked to address this body. And incidentally, this is the last major event of this conference, and therefore the burden on my shoulders is quite heavy. But I want to assure you that don't be carried away by what Daniel said about me. I'm just as ordinary as anyone here in this audience. And therefore, what I'm going to share with you might actually be the extent of my ignorance and not necessarily the depth of my knowledge. Please bear with me. Once again, I thank the organizers and also Casa África for this opportunity. But let me explain, as Dan has said, that I lost my luggage. It was misplaced. And that's why I'm not properly dressed, because usually in Nigeria, you dress formally for functions such as this, because you must dress appropriately. In Nigeria, we say you dress the way you want to be addressed. Having said that, I want to thank Miguel. As you can read there, Miguel and I got to know on the platform of the Commodities of Empire Conference in London in 2007. And I really want to credit him for maintaining that contact, sustaining that relationship. So Miguel is not just a colleague, he's a good friend and a dear brother. His able assistant, Daniel, has been the link man. And as you can see, Daniel is very creative, very energetic, and very restless. And I hope that by the time he gets to the status of Miguel, he will have slowed down a bit. But don't count on that. It's also a pleasure to come to Las Palmas, a very, very beautiful place. I can't get over the beauty of Las Palmas. And I do hope that the world will be as beautiful as Las Palmas is. I want to also thank my colleagues who are members of the International Maritime History Association for being here. Amelia has left, but Richard is here. And I want to say that I hope that I will represent you well tonight as I make this presentation. We've listened to a number of presentations since yesterday. Unfortunately, I missed quite a number of them. But from what we discussed today and what we listened to yesterday, we've done a lot about looking at ports and development, particularly in the Atlantic Basin. So my talk tonight will just focus on Africa, and I'm going to make it clear that given the challenges that I face, challenges of the expanse of the territory, the fact that I have to deal with material across linguistic, national and other barriers, I will have to limit my focus to an area that I'm most familiar with, and that is West Africa. Of course, I will extend my discussion to Central Africa, and of course, I try to go down the coast towards Angola and Namibia in particular. But in the course of this presentation, you're going to see reference to Dakar, to Abidjan, to Lagos, to Douala, to Walvis Bay in Namibia. Given the theme of this conference, what I'm trying to do tonight is to tell the African story on its terms and also in comparative perspective. We're going to see how African nations or nation states have managed the heritage of colonialism, how they have managed to sustain the indigenous or internal initiative, even though, as we know, much of what we have now is a carryover from the colonial period. My presentation is going to look at ports, essentially, even though I'll bring shipping into it. And you won't blame me for focusing so much on the hinterland as opposed to the forelands. But I try as much as possible to have a bridge across the forelands and maritime space, the ports and port cities, and the hinterlands. And let me just say that I prefer hinterlands to hinterland because we all know the hinterland is not a monolithic entity. You have gradations of hinterland, you have types of hinterland, stretching even from the quay or the port itself. I want to make a point that though this is quite an indirect reference, what we are discussing tonight is not just about how ports are managed or developed. Our discussion will raise questions about governance at the micro and macro levels in Africa, because if you're talking of development, whether of a nation, of a region like West Africa or South Africa, governance is implicated. And governance is something that involves different actors, different institutions, and different dynamics. So it can be claimed, and I hope that this claim can be sustained, that seaports, whether they are well run, whether they are not doing well, seaports reflect the quality of governance, whether the quality or the governance itself is developmental, entrepreneurial, or otherwise. And we're going to see that in local and national settings. The topic of this presentation talks about African ports and development. And therefore, on the one hand, we're going to discuss ports, but then we can't run away from the concept of development, as problematic as that appears to be. Excuse me. Development is a popular term, and my position is that if all of us in this room were to define it, we probably have as many as 20 or 30 definitions. But then, let me just adopt as the working definition for tonight's discussion, the concept of development as encompassing the following elements: economic growth, which of course we can measure, modernization, socioeconomic transformation, and distributional justice. This afternoon I was discussing with Daniel, and he was saying that for him, social justice and other elements will form the big picture, and you have development as a tiny element within. He focused on environmental sustainability and social justice. And then, of course, governance, economic development being the third element. But my own position, which of course aligns with his, is that when we talk of development, the way I understand it, it has to be a synergy, a combination of all these three elements. In other words, you cannot really talk of development if you don't have environmental sustainability and if you don't have social or distributional justice. This topic, in a sense, has been handled in a recent book edited by some Harvard professors. I'm sure that you'll see reference to it at the end of this paper. It was edited by 4 of them, following from a conference in Accra, Ghana, in 2010. Their aim, which of course is a common concern, is to understand why Africa is so far behind, first of all, in comparison to other nations, other groups, other regions of the world now, and why, based on work done by colleagues on the platform of the African Economic History Network, the recent development there is to explain why there seems to have been a reversal of fortunes. In other words, 3 or 4 or 5 centuries ago, Africa was competitive. Africa compared with other regions. The question is, why did Africa regress? And that, I think, is the fundamental question we need to address when looking at the whole concept, the whole issue of development. In the rest of this section, I tried to define Africa, consisting of the African mainland and, of course, the offshore islands. And I want to make the audacious claim that Africa should actually go to the United Nations and claim Las Palmas as one of its overseas territories. I'm sure that the Spaniards here will not find that very amusing. I just said that to tease you. But we are satisfied with what we have. We have Cape Verde, we have Equatorial Guinea, we have Sao Tome and Principe, we have Mauritius, the Comoro Islands, Madagascar, Pemba, and Zanzibar. So the issue is not that Africa lacks landmass. The issue is how Africa has managed the resources at its disposal. In this paper or in this presentation, I'm also limiting my focus to Africa below the Sahara. This choice might be questioned, but I think for me it's very, makes it easy for me. It's a convenient strategy because generally in Africa, the countries of the Maghreb and Egypt tend to look towards the Middle East, and they are so classified. And of course, they have the Mediterranean as their backyard. The rest of us south of the Sahara have common problems and we have faced common challenges. And the tendency for us is to look at that region of the world as a unit which of course is very diverse in terms of race, in terms of geography, in terms of the population makeup, in terms of resources, and so on and so forth. In looking at the history of Africa, looking at Africa in the long durée, we can think easily of 3 different epochs. The pre-colonial period, which of course historically is the longest, comprising several millennia. Then the colonial period, which of course might stretch from a century in the case of most countries in Africa to several centuries in the case of South Africa, because as far back as the 1650s, the Dutch had been at the Cape. In the case of Zambezia, the Portuguese had been there right from the 1500s. So in looking at, in delineating the colonial period, we have to make allowance for diversity, even within a country. For example, in my own country, Nigeria, the British had established a colony in Lagos as early as 1861. But then, the Sokoto Caliphate, the biggest indigenous state in Nigeria at the time, was not conquered until 1903. And therefore the question is raised, when was to which date can we attribute the origins of the British imperialist Nigeria? You can't say 1861 because that doesn't cover everything. You cannot even say 1903 because some areas had to be subjugated after 1903. I'm just making this point to let us know the complexity of the question of Africa, of colonialism, in looking at that. But in general, whether you're talking of the pre-colonial period or the colonial period or the period after colonialism, we can all agree, for those who are familiar with African history, that the 19th century was actually a watershed. This was a century of colonial subjugation, and as many of us know, the 1884-85 conference in Berlin, where the fate of Africa was determined without Africans being present, without Africans being consulted. So by and large, we now say that from 1884-85, and even before 1884-85, Lagos, for example, had been occupied, and some territories in Africa had been occupied. From that time, all through the 20th century, Africa had to struggle with colonial overlordship. And as late as 1975, Portuguese colonies in Africa, my Portuguese friends are here, were groaning under the yoke of Portuguese rule. And we're very grateful that it was actually a revolution in Portugal in 1974 that unshackled those territories. But as you also know, Southern Rhodesia, that's what you call Zimbabwe now, did not become independent until 1980, and apartheid did not end till 1994. So in looking at Africa, we're not looking at something, an entity that is monolithic. It is very diverse. The experiences are very challenging. And even if you look at history, not all African countries or territories were colonized. Liberia was founded as a base for resettling Africans in the diaspora. The same thing with Sierra Leone. But both Liberia and Ethiopia remained independent. In other words, they did not come under direct European rule. Of course, we know that from 1937 to 41, Italy invaded Ethiopia. And of course, we also know that some of those territories had substantial European settlements. Kenya, Southern Rhodesia, and of course, what we now know as the Republic of South Africa. So in general, we discovered that the colonial period created an economy that was based on the export of primary produce, whether you're talking of forest products or minerals, and that at the end of the day, people have attempted to draw what you call a balance sheet. I will not try to do that tonight because opinion is divided on that. But whatever you call development in Africa during the colonial period was not intended for the benefit. In other words, if you're talking of railways or road infrastructure, if you're talking of schools, and by the way, schools in Africa were begun by Christian missionaries for the most part. So it's a mixed picture. It's not something that you can generalize about because there are local peculiarities. But truly and indeed, the colonial period was epochal in the history of Africa. But I also want us to look at the other dimension to it. We agree, of course, that the impact was epochal. The impact has remained enduring. But there are a few things I want us to note. The first thing which will strike you is that some of the African countries, as they are now, are actually smaller in size, in population, than some of the states that the European powers destroyed in Africa. The Sokoto Caliphate covers a large part of Nigeria as it is now, and parts of neighboring countries, for example, Cameroon, even up to Niger, even some portions, some parts of Benin Republic. Whereas we have states as small as Togo and even Benin Republic, or even the Gambia, created in the aftermath of displacement of those countries, of those indigenous kingdoms. The second point I want to make is the impact of European languages. Here in this presentation, I alluded to the fact that we have more African speakers of Portuguese. My Portuguese friends will attack me again now. We have more speakers of Portuguese as a language than the Portuguese themselves in Portugal. We have more speakers of the English language in Africa than the English themselves in the UK. What that means, of course, is it's unfortunate, but it is true. One of the enduring consequences of colonialism has been very cultural, and that endures even till now. The other thing we need to note in passing is that the metropolis periphery relations established there then still subsist till today. So in looking at the concept of development in Africa, we need to take all these dynamics into consideration. I wouldn't be able to say that Africans themselves are complicit, because as we speak, many of those countries still belong to old school ties. The Commonwealth is still an association of old colonial territories ruled by the British, although I need to point out that some French or even Portuguese territories have joined. Cameroon is a striking instance of a non-British colony. Of course, the British had a mandate, a mandated territory, but then voluntarily they joined the Commonwealth. And of course, French colonial territories today belong to La Francophonie. By and large, we discover, I'm skipping this now so that I can go to the main item, that colonialism is dead, but colonialism still survives in many aspects and in many forms in Africa today. And in the course of our discussion tonight, we are going to see that in terms of port development, railway development, road development, the colonial impact still continues to be a key issue for development. However, and it's also important to acknowledge this, the nationalist governments themselves have attempted to tinker with this heritage, although, of course, the impact has been very uneven. And the impact, from what you can see, forgive me, the impact from what you can see has recorded limited success. Those who are familiar with African history will tell you about economic nationalism, import substitution industrialization, and regional integration. These are the initiatives of Africans themselves in the face of the continuing legacy of colonialism. For example, African nations such as Ghana, which was Gold Coast, and Nigeria, established their own shipping lines because in the case of West Africa, they attempted to get rid of the yoke of the conference lines, and particularly of Elder Dempster. Incidentally, Elder Dempster was actually very prominent here in Las Palmas. We saw some of the relics of the presence of Elder Dempster here in town this afternoon. Some of them also, most of the African countries also wanted to be rid of the dependence on all those former colonial territories, and therefore they resorted to import substitution industrialization. That, of course, failed as a strategy. And I think the most recent strategy has been regional integration. Again, that has produced mixed success. And all the efforts made at establishing state-owned enterprises have actually failed for the most part. The only surviving state enterprises, to the best of my knowledge, and which are of course doing well, are Ethiopian Airlines and the South African Airlines. They're exception to the rule. And it calls to question the success of what you might call economic nationalism or an anti-colonial economic strategy so far as we know. I've mentioned that. And the reason for this is not far-fetched. The problems essentially are internal, where you have countries that are notorious for systemic corruption, inefficiency, where the political system is that of patrimonialism, where you have, even till now, a high cost of doing business, and where there's lack of professionalism in handling state policies, then, of course, you can't have anything other than what you have here. My own characterization is that Africa is grossly or acutely underdeveloped. people have attempted to explain that in terms of colonialism, but I think that 50 years after independence, we should be looking for explanations elsewhere, because no nation actually develops on the basis merely of external dynamics. For development to be development, it has to be endogenous. It has to depend on the ingenuity of the people. Whether it is active or reactive, it has to be the initiative of the people. And somewhere in this lecture, I think I made reference to the issue of leadership. And in terms of leadership, I made the point that the situation got so bad that a Sudanese billionaire had to institute a prize for leadership in Africa. And unfortunately, there were years in which they couldn't even get suitable candidates to reward for that. And it's a recurring problem in Africa. In Table 1, which you are seeing there, we can see a profile of the exports of African countries, even as late as 2016. My own country, Nigeria, tops the list. I can see that crude oil exports, and of course that also will include natural gas exports, account for 91.6%. 91.6, almost 100%. So if you're talking of a monocultural economy, this is a bad example of it, but it is all the same. Cameroon appears to be more diverse because we have cocoa, wood, and all that, but those are primary products. Ghana, too, exports minerals, even though Ghana, too, is becoming an oil power as we speak. Angola is very close to Nigeria, maybe worse than Nigeria because it depends on oil, up to 95.2%, although it exports other things. Benin has a more diverse economy, but those elements are not, won't take Benin anywhere, because any country that produces and exports things in a semi-processed form is not likely to develop, no matter the volume of its exports and no matter the good intentions of its leadership, because ultimately the producers don't determine world market prices for these products. So we can see the profile of Cote d'Ivoire, of Senegal, of Namibia. Though countries such as Namibia and Senegal are more diverse, but they are still caught in that trap of overdependence on primary produce. All in all, and I think we need to just complete this section, the overall picture of African economic performance, even when we use flattering parameters such as GDP, I have never really been deceived by GDP figures, because as we all know, the GDP figures don't tell you much or anything at all about life, the lifestyle, the living conditions of the ordinary people. It doesn't tell you about economic justice or social justice or even the issue of environment, which are key issues when we consider development. And as we're discussing today, and as I've stated in this paper, even those that depend on oil as we speak, Nigeria, Angola, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea, are exporting an item which may not even be viable over the next 25 years. And that makes the situation dire, especially in a condition under which the available resources are not being well managed. Well, of course, we need to be fair enough to say that it is not all gloom, that we still have a few flashes here and there. For example, in the telecommunications sector, a lot of progress has been made since the 1980s, particularly the 1990s, in Nigeria, in Kenya, and I believe in Ghana as well. Those sectors that have improved at all have benefited from domestic and foreign direct investment. It's unfortunate that that has not been extended to all the key sectors of the economy. The port sector, which is what we're discussing tonight, of course, has benefited, although as we see later in this lecture, I have my own position, which is not entirely positive on the issue of port concessions. Let's move to the next issue of seaports and development, which is primarily why we're here tonight. I've said it here that ordinarily ports have acted throughout the ages as gateways between the territories on either side of the port. But then, I was also discussing this with Daniel this afternoon. We need to see ports as organic entities. They're like human beings. They're like any organism. They could thrive. They could live. They could decline. But then ports also die, just as human beings do. And the fortunes of ports may be affected by a combination of several factors, or even a single factor that could make a difference. We have natural forces. Earthquakes have ruined many ports. In 2015, for example, I was in Kobe port in Japan, and I could see that in spite of the best efforts at reconstruction of that port may never regain its lost glory. It's as bad as that. And it was only one incident that changed the fortunes of Kobe port. We have geographical factors at play. We have foreland influences, for example, the liner shipping, global trade and business cycles, war and blockades. We have political developments. For example, we are going to see later that some African ports were affected by domestic conflict or by civil wars and other calamities. And of course, some policy changes could also affect the fortunes of ports. Here, I've referred to the dissolution in the 1960s of the Mali Federation, which of course unshackled Mali and other hinterland states to think of alternative outlets for their products. The secession, as it were, of Eritrea has affected Ethiopia, because Eritrea used to be or had the main outlet for Ethiopia. Now the dynamics have changed. Conversely, apartheid affected the countries of Southern Africa, but as soon as apartheid crumbled, those countries that suffered by making use of distant outlets now could reorientate their trade towards South African ports. And of course, the civil wars that accompanied the liberation of Mozambique, Angola, and even the civil wars within the countries that affected Liberia and Sierra Leone during the 1960s all through the 1990s affected the ports in their respective regions. So in a nutshell, as we all know in this room, seaports are dynamic and multi-dimensional. They are complex institutions which, even though defined by location, interface with multiple institutions, agencies, and actors beyond their local and national boundaries. In fact, Malcolm Tull, who incidentally is the president of the International Maritime History Association, I just commented, and I agree with that ports deal with actors and organizations which themselves have overlapping and sometimes conflicting interests. And therefore, ports are vulnerable to a number of dynamics, often beyond their control. One issue we need to address at this point is to challenge or to interrogate the assumption that ports necessarily are developmental. And as we know, there has been a huge debate over that. Much of the literature, of course, supports the view that ports play a role in development. Again, we go back to our earlier discussion. We need to query the quality of that development, whether that development is a development that is sustainable, whether it is indigenous. We need to look at that. And I made reference to the fact that port impact studies were actually developed way back to justify investment in ports or to account for or make a case for expansion. Here in this presentation, I've taken time to look at the pros and cons of port impact studies, and I won't dwell on that. What is more important is for us to look at the connection, if there's any, between seaports and developments. On the one hand, and this seems to be the dominant view, ports are seen as growth poles. They are seen as enablers of economies of scale for both production and trade. But for seaports to be engines of local, regional, even national growth, they had to be competitive because, as we are told, port efficiency creates more economic benefits because it will allow for more cargo throughputs. Daniel just presented the paper to us this evening about the growth, and we had a discussion, which of course is relevant to what we are saying tonight, as to how you characterize the growth. His own position is that African economies have experienced growth after independence, and that using figures, throughputs. But of course, I shouldn't mention it in here, but we need to know, because I asked him questions. If you are comparing the colonial and the post-independence periods using those figures, one question that you need to ask, and we need to look at the question is, did the currency remain at the same level? Did the population remain at the same level? And what dynamics have changed? Those are issues that we discussed earlier this afternoon. What you need to understand, and that this is true for all that I've discussed here today and yesterday, is that perhaps we need to do more micro studies so that we do not overgeneralize about port impact, whether in the proximate locality of the port or even beyond the port itself. What is safe to say then is that the nexus between port and hinterland is symbiotic. In fact, I want to quote someone here who said, it is a two-way process and a function of varied economic, technical, political, and social forces. And the person also, and that's Hoyle and Healing in their publication of 1984, that the relationship is dynamic with periods of equilibrium and possibly more extended periods characterized by adjustment and change. What you can say then is that ports will serve strategic interests in the pursuit of national or sub-regional development policy. I won't go into the details of what others have demonstrated about the ability of ports to create jobs, to add value and all that. I have, in the course of my own research, come across the Japanese concept of the developer port, which of course was demonstrated at the port of Kashima. The port of Kashima had been developed for two reasons, two major reasons. The first reason was to decongest the Tokyo metropolis, which at a time had a population in excess of 15 million. And therefore, there was an attempt to see how industries and people could be moved out of the city, making use of the developer port strategy. The second thing that was targeted was to develop a backward part of the country. That place, Kashima, was just about 100 kilometers beyond Tokyo, but there was a big river that divided both, separated both places. And therefore, the logical thing was to now create a port at Kashima, which they did. And within a decade, you had a sizable town developed in the area. Port statistics rose from 0 within a decade to tens and hundreds of thousands and all that. The point is, at Kashima, that policy proved to have been a success. But then, this was in the context of Asia and in the context of a nationalist government. In Nigeria, for example, between 1913 and 1926, the colonial government adopted that. Of course, that was long before Kashima. Port Harcourt was created in a place where there was no real port. The whole idea, of course, was to create an outlet for coal from Enugu in the immediate hinterland within a distance of about 150 or 200 kilometers. But then there was also tin on the Jos Plateau, maybe about 300, 400 miles away. And therefore, the whole idea was to create a port other than Lagos with its own railway line to evacuate produce from that part of Nigeria. The point I'm trying to make is that when you look at those two contexts, and have similar contexts in Africa, I mentioned here the case of a port in Côte d'Ivoire, which was also developed as a developer port. But then, from those three examples, whether in Cote d'Ivoire or in Nigeria or Japan, that concept ought to be studied in its local or national setting. In other words, it is not a one-cap-fits-all policy that can work in all situations and circumstances. I mentioned the case of San Pedro just now. San Pedro was not as successful as Port Harcourt in Nigeria, and Port Harcourt certainly was not as successful as Kashima in Japan. The reason for that, I've stated in that section that you can see. We also have a certain class of developer ports, which we may also note. Those were ports that were created as outlets for particular strategic minerals or products. For example, Tema in Ghana was created in conjunction with the aluminum smelter industry in Ghana, but then it was also created with the aim of developing that region of Ghana. Again, we can say that compared to San Pedro in Cote d'Ivoire, this was a more successful instance of a developer port. We have other examples of ports that were single item crops. For example, the ports of Buchanan in Liberia and Sardinia Bay in South Africa were iron ore exporting ports. San Pedro in Cote d'Ivoire was focused on the export of timber. Tema in Ghana, aluminium, Lome and Kweme in Togo, phosphates, of course, Nigeria, we have One for crude oil, and Richards Bay in South Africa for coal. Those, of course, were developed in association with industrial projects, but with consequences for the local economy and the national economy. However, there's another view that says ports are not necessarily developmental. In fact, ports are seen as responding to dynamics, not catalyzing developments. That position has been vigorously advanced by people who have worked in certain local settings. It can therefore be asserted, and I agree with this position, that ports can be, but do not always function as growth poles. Quoting Ethan Corin, who wrote in 2010, we can say this, quote, while the benefits of a well-functioning port are at times difficult to quantify, the harm done by inefficient, low-capacity, or poorly run ports can be glaringly obvious, and that, of course, will include delays and demurrage, lack of capacity, congestion, and higher prices for staple goods. In other words, just as supposedly efficient ports can be developmental, inefficient ports can, by the same token, be described as anti-developmental. And another point you can raise about ports is that sometimes, while the intention might be to develop, that is to adjust or redress imbalance in development, ports also have the consequence, the effect of attracting investments, population, and other things to a particular portion of the country at the expense of others. And generally, if you look at the African coastline, discover that those ports just occupy a narrow strip across the coastline. And if you look at the distribution of resources in those countries, perhaps sometimes as much as 40% or more could be devoted or concentrated in a particular place. In Nigeria, for example, Lagos, as we speak, by virtue of the resources embedded in Lagos, by virtue of the size of that megacity, Lagos is actually the 5th largest economy in Africa. Just a single community, just a single town out of a huge. So ports can go either way. They can be developmental or anti-developmental. One other point we need to make is, in as much as ports can be, we may call them growth poles, the so-called growth also has attached to it some negative developments, which of course we are familiar with. Those who have lived in Las Palmas, and I was here in 2008, thanks to Miguel and Daniel, we testify that between 2008 and now, I have seen the city transformed. But then, in the course of that transformation, I have seen some new developments, traffic congestion being an issue. And the more ports you have, the more vehicles that you have, of course, you are doing something about your carbon footprints. We went to the port today and we saw, by way of casual observation, that sometimes prosperity or growth in traffic could have some unsavory consequences. And of course, the bigger a city is, the greater the possibility that the urban centers could be places where you have high rates of unemployment, crime, and of course, high costs of living. Excuse me. The point you are making in this lecture so far is that depending on particular contexts and circumstances, you can argue either way, that ports are developmental or ports are, if you like, anti-developmental. One thing that we can draw from that is that we then see that ports do not act alone. Ports act or operate or exist within a system or structure of dynamics or factors of institutions. And we can always see that in the context of port logistics synergy. We need to understand that no matter how much we try, we cannot actually limit the impact of a port to a particular locality. In other words, the developmental impact, if you call it that, in terms of growth, both negative and positive, often goes to such distances that sometimes you lose sight of the impact because you can't capture everything. And this, of course, is facilitated by hinterland links. In the case of Africa, the major hinterland link, of course, is the railway, and so on and so forth. I need to skip now because I want to move to other things. But before I do that, I want to point out that so far it appears as if the discussion has been focused on the hinterland dimension. I need to point out that we also need to take into account the foreland dimension too, the issue of shipping. We have now seen, and this is something that I've mentioned in this lecture at some point, that sometimes the pressure for port development, the pressure for growth, often comes from hinterland dimensions. We have been discussing so much about, and I think that in the course of this discussion, we are going to come across the issue of hub ports. Hub ports may appear to have been projects initiated by national or local governments, but essentially, the basic interest behind hub ports are the global shipping line because it makes for convenience on their own part. Ports, for example, such as Las Palmas and Algeciras and other, are interested in being the great port of any region. And of course, that has consequences. We have seen in the case of the colonial period how shipping conferences were formulated, were established by those shipping lines, which of course had an impact on the local economies. The whole issue of the quest for hub port status has been driven largely by a particular dynamic, and that dynamic has been the introduction of containerization. If you look at table 2, which I have there, we can see the comparison of some of the major ports. You have Tema in Ghana, Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire, the Lagos Ports Complex in Nigeria, the Dakar Port in Senegal, and of course the rising power of Cotonou in Benin Republic. You can see, of course, Cote d'Ivoire and Nigeria are the leading ports, but others are rising, and we are going to allude to that later. If you look at Fig 1, the map that follows, you are going to see the distribution of power, looking at the size of those circles that you find there, and you see the close race between Lagos and Abidjan in the whole process. What is important to emphasize at this point is that the hinterland structure actually plays a key role in the makeup, in the success or otherwise of those ports as we see them. And the hinterlands, as we know, the hinterland cuts across not just national boundaries, because you can see how big those balls are, those cycles. Those cycles will tell you that, and this is important for us to know, that it depends on your relationship across the border sometimes in developing your port. Calabar Port in Nigeria, for example, is a major victim of colonial boundary because the boundary was carved out in such a manner that the natural hinterland of Calabar is in the neighboring Republic of Cameroon. And as some of you know, because even before the issue of Bakassi came up, Nigeria and Cameroon have had fraught bilateral relations. And in the context of that, you can imagine how it is difficult, if not impossible, to make Calabar a better port than it is now. I mentioned the issue of logistics infrastructure, which of course we can take on board, because without the necessary infrastructure, even with the best of intentions, a port cannot be entirely competitive. In the next section of this presentation, I profiled African ports, and I attempted to look at them in historical perspective. Most of those ports were lagoon ports, particularly during the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Being a lagoon port, of course, cut them off from the open sea, but then in the age of the Atlantic slave trade, that disadvantage conferred a dubious advantage, because it was possible for them, particularly for Lagos and Badagry, to evade the anti-slavery squadron at the time, and which was why slavery, the traffic persisted, because those ports, or those who patronized them, took advantage of the nature of the ports to evade the anti-slavery squadron, and that enabled the trade to persist longer than it should have done. So until the application of technology, particularly from the late 19th century, that's from the 1890s onwards, many of these ports remain cut off from the sea. And in case of Lagos, which you are familiar with, the bar at the mouth of the harbor proved a great barrier. And between 1892 and 1914, so much was done by way of investment in infrastructure, in money, to open up the port. In fact, it was not until 1914 that Lagos became, truly speaking, a seaport in terms of ocean shipping coming right into the harbor. So generally, if you look at focusing on the ports of West Central Africa, which I mentioned earlier on, we discovered that many of them were served by inland waterways, rivers, lagoon systems, and all, until the development that took place, particularly during the colonial period. I've studied Lagos, and I know that up to 1914, Lagos received the bulk of foodstuffs consumed in the city by way of the lagoon network. Even when the railway was constructed, and the railway had gone beyond Abeokuta, beyond Ibadan, it had even gone as far as the Niger. By 1912, we discovered that the river system was a great competitor, gave serious competition to the nascent railway system. We need to consider, of course, that with the intensity of colonial rule, the intensity of investment in railways and ports, the whole situation changed. And on the eve of the First World War, we can say that the basic infrastructure, the structure of the infrastructure linking the ports to the hinterlands, across West Africa in particular, had been established. Railways were the linchpin, but roads were complementary. And in fact, both were competitive up to some point. Where you even had natural harbors, and the point I should have made earlier on is to point out the fact that the whole of Africa, along the Atlantic coastline, has a peculiar characteristic. By virtue of geography or nature, it is a region that has perhaps the least natural harbors in terms of number, compared, for example, to Japan, an archipelago that has hundreds of ports. Here in West Africa, in fact, along the Atlantic coastline, one striking thing you see is that you have so many ports, but only a few of them have deep natural harbors. The deepest, of course, being the one in Freetown, Sierra Leone. Even where you had such harbors, you still had to apply capital and technology to deepen them and make them accessible. I've profiled in this section what the colonial governments did. First of all, the strategy of developing ports, and second, at the same time, of developing railways to evacuate produce to and from the ports. The implication of that, and we should not lose sight of it, is as soon as railways were constructed alongside ports, the whole process of port concentration received a fillip during that period, because any port that had rail links automatically had an edge over other ports that still relied on inland waterways or roads. And in the process, some of those ports went into irreversible decline. And today, we mentioned the case of St. Louis in Senegal, which to all intents and purposes is now a dead port. Sorry. So nationalist governments, that is after independence, not only established shipping lines, as you mentioned, but then they invested in ports. And as soon as each country desired to have a national port of its own, as soon as there was no regional focus or common strategy, it then meant that you were creating conditions for intense interport competition. And of course, that competition is what has fueled, even in the era of containerization, the desire for every port in West Africa, for example, to be a hub port. The good thing about the whole situation is not only that the ports will compete, and in the Darwinian sense, only the best will survive. The other good thing that we can see is that this development is taking place in the context of regional integration. Regional integration has at least achieved one thing: freedom of movement of people, of persons across West Africa. Unfortunately, of course, you still have some of those barriers erected right from the colonial period, cutting off people from the trade and the opportunities across the border. However, insofar as we can say, as we can tell, ECOWAS as a regional economic integration strategy has only succeeded not in terms of integrating the economies, but in terms of integrating the people, in terms of free movement, as I just mentioned now. It is, in my own opinion, far behind, for example, the SADC in Southern Africa, and of course, the East African experiment collapsed even before the ECOWAS initiative. But what we can say in favor of ECOWAS is that ECOWAS has, while on the one hand, it has not succeeded in achieving economic integration, ECOWAS has at least achieved something that's very critical. Without relying necessarily on the United Nations, ECOWAS has managed to maintain peace in its territory. For example, you cannot talk of the resolution of crisis in Liberia, even in Cote d'Ivoire in 2002, or Sierra Leone, without the effort of ECOWAS. In other words, ECOWAS has been forced by circumstances to go beyond the primary focus on economic integration to look at the political question. Because as we well know, if you do not resolve the political question, the whole issue of development will have been a mirage. I've just mentioned in passing, and I think we need to address that before we conclude, the issue of port concessions. Table 3, as you can see, talks about the port concessions that took place between 2004 and 2011. You can see that, sorry, table 3. Okay, so you can see the dates. The dates are different, and it is also striking that the terms are actually different. Some 25 years, some 15 years, some 10 years, some even 35 years. And you begin to wonder on what grounds and by what means and under what conditions were those agreements fashioned. And I asked somewhere in this lecture whether those concessions were not made more or less under duress. How fair and how helpful or developmental are these concessions? But one thing we need to concede, and observers have noticed that too, that no matter how bad the terms were, we can say in the short term that those concessions have actually produced better results in terms of management of those terminals. This concessions regime, as we know, has been a product of the whole process of containerization. Before I conclude this lecture, I want to say that one theme that has interested me, which I think might be the way forward when we talk of ports and development, is the whole role played by transport corridors. So I pose the question as to whether transport corridors can actually become development corridors, particularly in West Africa. If you look at table 4 there, you see the number of transport corridors that have been identified along the entire Atlantic coast, all the way from West Africa to Southern Africa. Each one has a hub port, which of course I've indicated here. The range of the corridor is indicated, the distance covered is indicated, the transport mode between the ports and the hinterlands is also indicated. And you can see from the transport mode that, unfortunately, only a few actually depend on rail transport, which of course is cheaper and more effective than road transport. Most of them are based on road transport, and many of them have faced challenges of management. For example, it has been discovered that many of those corridors have been affected by what we call toll gates. Toll gates, of course, is a concept that explains the fact that if you are transporting containers from the port to anywhere within the country or outside the country, you have what people call checkpoints. Containers and vehicles are stopped, are searched. Well, not because they are carrying anything contraband, but because it's also a system of feeding off what people think is largesse or a common patrimony. Somewhere in this lecture, I've mentioned the fact that a country such as Benin took the unprecedented step of attaching military escorts to vehicles conveying things from the port to the neighboring country, Niger. But of course, you know that a soldier, a military personnel, cannot cross frontiers. So what Benin has done is to secure those items up to its boundary, and then beyond that boundary, the soldiers will not go beyond that. And the implication is that while you could control developments and therefore keep costs down within Benin, you couldn't control whatever will happen in Niger Republic. And therefore, in a sense, that strategy, a very unusual strategy, has worked, but then it has not provided an absolute solution to the challenge of facilitating movement along those corridors, keeping the cost of doing business low, and ensuring that, as I mentioned, those transport corridors could even become engines of development. The highways on which those corridors are based, you can see the network of roads across the region. And in addition to those transport corridors, we also have transit corridors. We have intra-regional corridors, and we have 2 east-west corridors. Those ones are explained in this paper. And in the course of analysis, we discovered that some corridors are more efficient than others, maybe in terms of the cost of doing business, maybe because of state policy and all that. But we have discovered that the whole concept of toll gates, security or securing the commodities, and of course the whole issue of what people pay, legitimate and otherwise, has hampered those developments. The legacy of colonialism also plays a role here. For example, if you look at the link between Dakar, Abidjan, and Lomé, all those were within the former French Empire, and therefore traversing national boundaries is much easier compared, for example, to movement from Nigeria to a French country. And those issues are there, they are lingering, but then there are issues that have to be tackled along the way. One other thing is that some of those ports have the advantage of rail and road. Others have just access by road. Therefore, the ones that have dual links, dual channels, are likely to do better, and they have done better so far. The analysis shows that the transit corridor between Cotonou in Benin Republic and Niamey in Niger Republic, which handled 2.2 million metric tons in 2015, is the busiest in West Africa. And it's surprising. You will have thought that Lagos, with its vast hinterland, with its rail network, and of course with its resources, will have done better than that. But Lagos is not competitive for the reason I just mentioned now. The fact that if the cost of conveyance is high, people will migrate to other routes. And one thing that we have discovered, which is quite surprising, is that Cotonou Port is actually conveying merchandise, traffic meant for northern Nigeria itself. In other words, some parts of northern Nigeria are patronizing Cotonou port instead of the national port in Lagos, evidently because it had become uneconomical for them. Because if you make a choice between patriotism and your pocket, of course you know where you will cast your vote. So we see that the least costly corridor, of course, was also Benin. Compared to Lagos, the cost for Benin was 3,938, compared to 4,552 for Lagos GBA. GBA is in Niger State, in Niger Republic. And then Abidjan to Ouagadougou corridor could cost you as much as $5,095. I mentioned the issue of delays at border crossings and checkpoints. And this also have been calculated. I mean, totally an average of 98 minutes for Cotonou, 98 minutes. As long as that is, it is actually the shortest in the entire region. We can go on and on and on. One corridor that I've mentioned here, which is identified in Table 5, is the coastal corridor between Abidjan in Cote d'Ivoire and Lagos, Nigeria. It is unique for covering a territory inhabited by 40 million persons. And in doing so, you have to cross, as I mentioned, national frontiers. But if you look at Table 5, you're going to see the statistics there of daily traffic, of port dwell times, of the number of checkpoints, and that's important. If you look at it, Cote d'Ivoire has the lowest, of course, because that's the point of origin, and Ghana has the highest for whatever reasons. Of course, those reasons can be attributed to national policy and how much control you have over your police and military forces. We can go on and on like that. I've identified the Volvish Bay Corridor in Namibia as that which has the highest impact, the potential of having the greatest impact along the Atlantic coast. But my conclusion there is that only time will tell whether our optimistic projections about that corridor will be justified by time and experience. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I want to conclude at this point. I'm concluding by saying that this presentation has probably raised more questions than it has answered, but then we can make some general observations. The first, of course, which is obvious, is that African economies are underdeveloped when compared to the promise and potential that they had at independence from foreign rule. I'm sorry that I have to diverge from my good friend Daniel. Daniel has a more optimistic view of this, but I have a more skeptical view of that. I'm sorry about that. So the point I'm trying to make is, yes, you have changed the personnel. Yes, you have changed the flags, but much of the old order remains. And that old order, in many instances, has hobbled rather than helped the situation. These countries, I agree with Daniel, have experienced or posted spurts of growth. Of course, these are sporadic, and these are sporadic gains from foreign trade. But we have not seen enough of structural change within those economies or evidence of distributional justice, which, of course, are the key drivers or indicators of true development. The second point I want us to note is that those seaports have not truly optimized their potential as growth poles. Of course, we need to concede that in local settings, I just mentioned Lagos developing based on the port, as it were, into the fifth largest economy in Africa. We can concede that. We can concede in a few instances that, yes, you can see port-led growth in some senses. But then those so-called achievements have recorded countervailing disadvantages, which were mentioned in the course of this lecture. The third point I want to make is that technology has made a difference in terms of how ports have developed over time. And in recent times, we have seen that there's so much focus on expanding port facilities. We are not getting bigger and bigger ports. Today, for example, when we went to Las Palmas, we could see that as big as Las Palmas port is, as successful as it appears to be, that port is actually expanding. And it then means that, of course, the more successful you are, the greater your desire for more success. In the West African case, and indeed across Africa, what that means is that expatriate cartels in the shipping industry have actually been the main drivers of the concentration of ports, of traffic in certain ports. And that has led me to ask the question, are we experiencing a new form of neocolonialism? I've quoted Debris there, who said, and I want to quote this in full, he said, we still need to see through future research whether this recent rationalization of the port system, which provides international operators with very large productivity increases and returns on investment, also benefits the economies of West Africa, or if it merely benefits the networks of the companies involved. That is something that I think we need to ponder as we move on. Another thing that I want us to note is that the integration of port construction with railway and road development, which started in the colonial period, has made some ports to enjoy an advantage over others. That is obvious enough. And that tells us that intermodal transport in the hinterlands is critical to the whole subject of whether ports can compete, number one, or whether ports can generate development in those hinterlands on the other hand. So the ability to retain or increase levels of port traffic will largely depend on a combination of factors, including, of course, the competitiveness of intermodal hinterland logistics, the endowment, economic development and population of their hinterlands, the efficiency of port management, and that's a critical issue, which, of course, is being addressed by way of port concession, and that, of course, will include issues of tariff, length of dwell and turnaround times for shipping, security in the ports, and all that. We also need to factor in reduction of bottlenecks along the corridors we just discussed now. It is likely, and this is my own projection, that heightened competition among seaports along this coastline, along transport corridors, will benefit landlocked countries. The greater the competition among these ports, the greater the likelihood that those landlocked countries will have they can negotiate from a position of strength, because it then will be a buyer's market. A fifth point I want to make is the role of containerization in all these developments we are talking about. And what it has done, from what I've said here, is that it has latched Africa on to the juggernaut of globalization. Containerization has been helped along by hinterland logistics, especially railway and roads. And you must also mention the fact that inland container terminals have also come into the picture. What you can deduce from that is that it is only ports that are adaptable to this dynamic that will survive and prevail in the ensuing interport competition. A sixth point I want to make is about the quest for hub status among the seaports of West and Central Africa. The whole quest has been pushed or driven not only by port authorities themselves, but with the support and interest of national governments, and of course, on the other hand, the global shipping cartels. What I deduce, and I think that you probably have an alternative opinion, is that in West and Central Africa, the likelihood is that because these governments, because these ports have invested so much in their individual projects, it is not likely that any single port will then become the sole hub for the region. In fact, we have a number of them that are very, very strong now. Lagos, Abidjan, and Tema are leading candidates. We want to see whether what they are doing is sustainable in the short run or in the long run. But what I believe that what will happen is that those three ports, and others, of course, in Tier 2, will draw substantial interland traffic if only they can operate efficiently and, of course, accommodate increasingly larger container ships. We are seeing now, and this is very clear, a conjunction of two dynamics. Number one dynamic, local pressure for port diffusion. On the other hand, we see global shipping demand for port concentration. How those two dynamics will be managed will be a task for the next decade at least. The seventh point I want to mention is that these developments also have a consequence we need to note right now, and that is that there's the likelihood of overcapacity in the port section. And this of course, will yield two scenarios. Number one, the inevitable depletion of hydrocarbon reserves on which you have built ports will cause a crisis. Once those hydrocarbons dry up, what happens to ports that were developed because of that dynamic? That is one thing we need to consider. The second thing we need to consider is that the whole idea of developing ports was driven by optimism and economic nationalism. But then, to what extent can optimism and economic nationalism face the reality of economic vicissitudes that are on the horizon, again, in the context of huge investments already made in the port? The final point I want to make, which of course is obvious, is that seaports are not isolated actors or entities. They operate at the level, at the interface between the local and the global. And therefore, for ports to succeed in this region, they must manage a complex relationship among multiple actors and factors. And at the same time, they must manage, and successfully too, to harness the domestic and external dynamics, which of course are implicated in their growth. We need to learn from what was observed in the case of East Africa, and I quote, "The increasing scale of activity and the increasing degree to which local networks and systems rooted in maritime transport reflect global, technological and economic trends, while remaining conditioned particularly by national scale political conditions." The point is, those dynamics are in play, and it is the interplay of those dynamics that determine what the future of African ports and the African economies will be. No seaport, and this is my conclusion, can develop above the capacity of its domestic economy. It means that any consideration of African seaports as growth poles must adopt a holistic approach. But then, ports, I believe, can play a role in addressing Africa's historic economic underdevelopment. And we can conclude this conference by reaffirming what was observed elsewhere, which I think is something we need to ponder, and that will be our takeaway from this conference. And that is that the seaport, quote, is both a cause and a result of development. I want to thank you for your patience. Thank you.
Sí, hay tiempo, sí. Hasta las 1:30 sin problema, o sea, 3 o 4 preguntas.
Vale, tenemos tiempo hasta las 1:30 que tenemos que salir para hacer algunas preguntas o comentarios.
Si quiere, Daniel, se pueden hacer las preguntas seguidas y que él vaya contestando.
Sí.
Y así ganamos tiempo.
Déjame 5 minutos para una información.
Un minuto. Lo puedes dar ya si quieres.
¿Sí?
Sí.
Bueno.
Antes de, para ya poder no estar en la presión.
Bueno, sí. Mientras Ayodeji descansa un poquito, una información rápida. Mañana... Bueno, decirles que la gobernanza, la red de la gobernanza de los puertos, es tradición hacer una asamblea, una reunión de los miembros de la gobernanza. Lo hemos intentado ayer, teníamos también la intención de tal vez hoy si teníamos tiempo, pero se nos ha echado encima el tiempo, ¿no? Por lo tanto, sí nos gustaría recoger la opinión de todos. Quizás ahora en la cena podamos intercambiar opiniones, o mañana, si tenemos la ocasión también, en el transcurso de la excursión que vamos a hacer por la ciudad de Las Palmas, podemos seguir haciendo estos intercambios. Y si tenemos la posibilidad de hacer una puesta en común, pues mejor. De cualquier manera, les digo que el Comité Científico de la Gobernanza ha analizado las comunicaciones, las propuestas, ya le hemos hablado de las publicaciones, cómo serán. El comité científico tiene la posibilidad de unir las comunicaciones en una publicación de la Universidad de Las Palmas, también de la revista Vegeta y otras revistas. Y luego el comité científico también decidió que el próximo encuentro puede ser en los primeros meses de 2019 y es posible que sea en la ciudad de Gant de Bélgica. Entonces, pues ahí espero que nos veamos. Y el tema no lo hemos decidido, pero puede ser alrededor del puerto, medio ambiente, nuevas actividades portuarias como turismo, etcétera. Solamente esto, y luego, bueno, ya nos vamos a la cena y podemos seguir hablando, ¿no? De cualquier manera, si hay después al final alguna posibilidad de alguien que plantee alguna cuestión en torno a la red, pues la recogemos, ¿no? Gracias. Bueno, yo también quiero darle las gracias a Ayodeji. Sí, darle las gracias a Ayodeji por su magnífica conferencia. Yo creo que nos ayuda a avanzar en los estudios que hemos iniciado en la gobernanza sobre puertos y desarrollo y que nos va a permitir marcar líneas para seguir haciendo investigaciones. Me parece que ese tema que yo apuntaba de puerto y medio ambiente, etcétera, pues también se puede derivar de la conferencia que ha pronunciado Ayodeji y efectivamente de reuniones futuras. Gracias.
Voy a hacer un comentario para romper el hielo y después se animan. De nuevo comparto las palabras del profesor Miguel Suárez sobre tu intervención, que ha sido magistral realmente. A mí me gustaría conocer tu opinión sobre el modelo de crecimiento portuario que se hizo muy famoso en los años 60 y 70 de Taft, el famoso modelo de Taft and Morrill, sobre crecimiento en los países, en los antiguos países coloniales, en el África, en Asia, etcétera, porque en particular en el caso africano, en ese momento de crecimiento económico, etcétera, justo después de la independencia, parecía que el sistema, la estructura de transporte colonial iba a cambiar de forma radical por los nuevos gobiernos. Pero efectivamente, actualmente observamos que ese modelo de dispersión que se iba a plantear durante los años 60, 70, etcétera, vuelve de nuevo hacia una mayor concentración vinculado al tema del contenedor fundamentalmente. Me gustaría saber tu opinión sobre esta cuestión. Si el modelo paradigmático de Taft y Morrill ahora mismo ya ha quedado finalmente descartado. ¿Alguna pregunta más para añadir? Sí. Yes.
Bueno, yo me uno a las felicitaciones, pero no felicitarte a ti por la magnífica conferencia, sino felicitarnos a todos por haber tenido la oportunidad de escucharlo. Para nosotros los economistas, aquí estamos historiadores y economistas, es de verdad una maravilla poder oír esto y poder insertarlo en la idea que tenemos nosotros de la economía, y quizás un poco más abstracto que la realidad que nos has pintado. Bueno, para mí ha sido fantástico. Y bueno, una cuestión es, en algún momento dijiste que los puertos de West África tenían que aprender de los puertos de East África. ¿Por qué? ¿Cuál es la diferencia? ¿Qué desarrollo han tenido los puertos de East África diferente a West África? Muchas gracias.
Bueno, Well, I promised that I will raise questions, but I will not provide answers. And I won't allow anyone to trap me into producing definite answers, because my task, I believe, was to raise questions and make us think out of the box. But let me just I won't address the specific questions asked, but I'll make general remarks. As regards the fate of ports, as early as 1970, you saw that book published on Seaports and Development in Tropical Africa, a contribution made by a Nigerian geographer. He's dead now, Babafemi Gundana. I believe was epochal, it was enduring, because he was able to identify that port development oscillates between two extremes, concentration and diffusion. I may be wrong, but I think it was one particular scholar that advanced that. He used Nigerian evidence, which I think is also applicable. However, in looking at what could cause concentration or diffusion, as we speak now, it appears as if global shipping is what is driving concentration. But Ogundana proved a point, and that was long before we had containerization, that a number of factors and forces could force national policy on ports to either go in the direction of concentration or diffusion. Let me just give an example. During global wars, the First World War, the Second World War, and in the case of Nigeria, the Civil War, conditions of hostility meant that you had to limit your external outlets to a number of ports, where, of course, you could ensure security and control trade. And in the case of the First World War and also the Second World War, you knew that shipping was affected by requisition, it was affected by submarine warfare, and therefore you couldn't afford to expand your coastal outlets and your seaports. So warfare at the global level, warfare at the national level, in the case of civil wars, and even if you look at the case of Liberia and Sierra Leone, you couldn't talk of shipping and ports in Sierra Leone and Liberia when they had their civil wars in the 1990s. Because obviously, each party wanted to control the port, and each party didn't want the other person to import arms. So economic depression is also another dynamic, forcing governments to limit traffic to a few ports. So the dynamics, in the paper, for example, I mentioned the fact that Pepel Port in Sierra Leone, it's one of the footnotes, stopped, it couldn't operate for about 5 years or so, because the main item passing through that port was iron ore. There was a problem in the mines. Production stopped, and therefore the port practically dried up. It was only when production resumed that the port came alive. In other words, economic dynamics, business cycles, or exigencies, or in the case of Kobe, which I just mentioned, natural disasters like an earthquake or tsunami could force the closure of a particular port, maybe a strategic port, and therefore impose on a country or a region port concentration. As we speak, we don't have such scenarios in West Africa. What we have is a desire on the part of global players to limit the ports of call, because, of course, evidently it's cheaper for them to do so. So in looking at the whole cycle, whether the port system is enlarged, whether it is restricted, we need to look at domestic issues, domestic dynamics, and also relate that to the global. And sometimes also, there's often a conjunction between the global and the local at the same time. And therefore, there are many dimensions, there are many issues involved in this process. One thing that Daniel and I have agreed, and I think is applicable in relation to models of port development, is that ports are organisms like human beings. They could thrive, they could shrink, they could also die. And therefore, what we discussed this afternoon, which I think is applicable in this context, is we should be careful as to how we generalize. Because a port could have a very rich hinterland, but it might not thrive because of some local problems within the port city itself, or within the region, or something that happened from outside of those shores that do not make that port competitive. And therefore, whether we are modeling whether we're making projections, we need to be flexible enough to consider not just obvious dynamics, but also consider the unintended, the unexpected. Because one thing that is constant in history is change, the dynamic of change. That's very important. Regional comparisons in Africa could be very problematic. And I was looking at how national governments and port stakeholders worked on East African ports. Of course, all those ports have common problems of efficiency, corruption, and of course, East African countries in general are relatively poorer than those of West Africa. But it also means that if you don't have resources, you can make up for your lack by managing the little that you have. So one thing that is striking or peculiar about East African ports, unlike West African ports, is that you actually have two clearly dominant ports in that region. You have Dar es Salaam, you have Mombasa. So whatever, in other words, it will not make sense for any government to multiply or diffuse ports in that region. So perhaps one thing that West Africa needs to learn is to see that on their own part, they don't need to wait for global players. On their own part, they can rationalize. Rationalize at the level of the nation. Let me just digress a little. During Nigeria's Second Republic, that was from 1979 to 1983, when the politicians took over after 13 years of military rule, what politicians did, which I think is done elsewhere, is that they were embarking on port projects, not on the basis of economic plans and projections, but just for a bridge to nowhere. They were building ports and airports because, there's one vote catcher, there's a powerful politician who will deliver votes, and therefore, let's site that port behind his village. It will not make any economic sense, but it will make political sense at that time. So we discover that such considerations come into play. That was not the case in East Africa. And therefore, although there were local ports that wanted to compete with Dar es Salaam or with Mombasa, they fizzled out. And it made economic sense for those countries to focus on those ports. Those ports are overwhelmingly superior to other ports in East Africa, and it will be difficult to consider, to think of a port that can upstage Dar es Salaam or upstage Mombasa within their national territories or even across the region. One thing that we also learn is that some territories, some regions across national boundaries, barriers, actually patronize some of those ports. I mentioned the case of Calabar in Nigeria. Calabar should have been drawing trade from a particular region of Cameroon closest to it. But that would not be, first of all, because Cameroon and Nigeria were under different colonial powers. And the funny thing, which people find shocking, is that those colonial territories inherited the prejudices of their former colonial powers. I'm talking as a West African now. The Nigerian is more at home with the Ghanaian, who is English-speaking, than with the Cameroonian next door, who is French-speaking. So those considerations are there. In the case of Cameroon, the whole issue of the Bakassi Peninsula has poisoned relations. And Cameroon sees itself as a countervailing force against what might be seen as Nigerian hegemony in that region. So those factors will work against, for example, Calabar Port being an outlet for the region of Cameroon closest to it. But that has not been the case in East Africa. Some remote parts of adjoining regions exported their produce through either of those ports, depending on location or distance and the cost of doing our business. East Africa is not a paradise, but there are a few things we can learn, and they too can also learn from the West African experience. Thank you.